Suppose I give you two groups of people. The first is a group of sedentary office workers in an average American city. The second group is a tribe of highly active hunter-gatherers in Africa who survive by foraging off the land and tracking game like baboons and giraffe and hunting for their meat with handmade bows and arrows. And if I were to ask you, which of these two groups of people likely burns more calories in a day, which group would you pick? Oh, and before you guess, let me add one more thing. The men in the African tribe, they walk around 7 miles on average per day. Well, the answer is obvious, isn't it? It should be the hunter-gatherers. They are objectively more active, they lead much more physical lives, and are much more exposed to the elements. All factors that we know burn calories, right? But here's what's wild. When researchers actually tested the two groups to actually determine which group burned more calories, the results, not as expected. Turns out, each group consumed and burned almost exactly the same. This shocking observation is what some refer to as the exercise paradox. And this study, and studies like this, are often what serves as the scientific backing for some to claim confidently that while exercise may be good for many things, increased muscle mass, strength, cardiovascular benefits, stress reduction, weight loss isn't one of them. But as compelling as astounding as these results are, is that what's really going on here? Has one of our fundamental beliefs about exercise truly been turned on its head? Or is something else at stake here? Have we really stumbled upon a paradox with respect to exercise or the calorie burn side of the calories in, calories out equation? Or are we really seeing an issue on the consumption side? That quite possibly we're seeing evidence that may cause us to question some of our most basic ideas regarding calories as a whole. With that, I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Unconditional with Norbie Schickel. It is great to be back and to be back with you. If you are new to the show, as always, welcome to you too. Okay, we are in luck because we've got an awesome, mind-blowing, I think I can promise that. So yeah, mind-blowing episode as we go into one of the most fascinating studies and concepts that I've ever heard about with respect to human health and nutrition. Okay, full stop. Now, we've talked about a few studies in the past few weeks, and I think it's fair to say that today we're going to just nerd out a little bit more, okay? Maybe you can give me one more week of nerding, and then I have a change in direction planned for next week, okay? But even though I think one should tread very carefully when it comes to a reliance on studies to inform individual health and fitness decisions, I do think that they can be very, very illuminating at times. And of course, we should always warn that the contrast between what the study says versus what people talking about it says that the study says is always important to keep in mind. Okay, and that includes me. So I'm definitely going to link to both sources that we're going to discuss today, and you can take a look for yourself. Highly recommend doing that. But this is one of those studies that has really informed my thinking. I guess you could say what's probably my bias at this point against the completion and the correctness of the idea of energy balance, right? I think there's some things that are incomplete about it. But this idea of calories in, calories out, or what some people often refer to as the law of thermodynamics when it comes to human health and nutrition. Now, the study we're going to talk about today is titled Hunter-Gatherer Energetics and Human Obesity, and it's by a guy named Herman Pontzer. Okay, now, Herman Pontzer, he's been on a number of big podcasts. I think I saw that he was on Andy Galpin's podcast. So there's been a few of these. So he's made the rounds in sort of the podcast and YouTube circuit. And I will say he's an incredibly funny guy. I watched a lecture that he gave years ago on YouTube, and he's very funny. So worth watching, worth checking out some of his content if you haven't seen it. But he's an American evolutionary anthropologist and biologist. He's a faculty member at Duke. And the paper that we're going to discuss today was initially published all the way back in 2012. Now, there's another piece by Pontzer that was published for a lay audience in Scientific American in 2017. And the title of that piece is called The Energy Paradox. Okay, much better title. I like that a whole lot more. And it covers Ponser's work with the Hadza as well, right? Sort of references his work from the earlier academic study. Now, as much as I love this study, and there is a lot to like about it, okay, we've got hunter-gatherers, we've got comparisons to farmers, we've got measurements on the caloric burn of gorillas, okay, and just hell yeah, right? Gorillas, they are my favorite animal, okay? My kids know this, my wife knows this, but I love gorillas. And I love the fact that they thought to add gorillas to the study, because that's always where my head goes. Whenever anyone's making comparisons to an animal and they're saying, yeah, we did this, we saw it in a rat study, etc., I'm always like, yeah, but what about gorillas? Okay, that could be like, I don't know, the subtitle to every single episode is what about gorillas? And certainly it could be the name of this episode. But that's where my head always goes. And here's the thing, even if you don't love gorillas, and I can just set aside for a second that if you don't like gorillas, you are probably a sociopath, okay? Not medical advice, but it's probably true. There's a lot to love about this study, even if, spoiler, I'm ultimately going to disagree with its conclusions. Now, I always talk stakes and context before getting into the details. So let's zoom up a bit. Let's look at the big picture of why this is important. Now, of course, the answer is pretty obvious, right? We are currently in the middle of an unprecedented rise in obesity and metabolic dysfunction in the United States and most of the developed world. At the time of this recording, and you guys know this, 40% of the adult American population is obese. Not overweight, not holiday chubby, obese. And as I've said before, I'm not judging, okay? As many of you know, at one point in my adult life, I was nearly 50 pounds heavier, officially obese. Okay, so never any judgment from my perspective. Being overweight, normal weight, underweight, it's not a moral thing. Okay, there's just no moral connotation one way or the other. And it's super important to say that and to just keep banging that drum. Now, that said, aside from the fat pride movement for like a hot second, this dramatic rise in the rate of obesity and diet-related diseases like type 2 diabetes, this is not a welcome change for most people. Okay, I don't think that's controversial to say. Given that the estimates place the number of deaths from obesity and diet-related disease at somewhere between 112,000 and 600,000 Americans every year, the stakes are very, very real. And what is causing this dramatic shift? Right, a 40% obesity rate? That's nearly 3x the rate from 50 years ago. How did this happen? You can look at photos of people that have posted online of Americans in like the 1960s and 70s out on the beach, and you won't find a single overweight person. What happened? And any amount of change in this amount of time, it's not genetic, right? There clearly is some other factor at play here. And I would argue, and I will argue, that it's not willpower either. Okay, I've made this point before. Now, of course, the conventional wisdom here, the scientific consensus, is that this is fundamentally an issue of energy balance. We overconsume calories, and due to our modern sedentary lifestyle, we don't burn enough calories through movement, right, physical work and exercise that we did historically. And therefore, we get fat. It's neat, it's clean, it's simple. Unfortunate because it's your fault. You lack willpower, you lack discipline. But the explanation, no, that's definitely not the issue. But how often have we seen the conventional science flipped completely on its head? We literally just saw that happen with the food pyramid. When I was a kid, you were a complete nut if you thought eating fat didn't make you fat. If you thought saturated fats were anything other than just a heart attack waiting to happen. And now, a whole lot of that has changed. And here's the thing. I wouldn't be surprised at all if I saw that flip again in my lifetime. But if the conclusions in this study are correct, then at a minimum, we've got at least half of the explanation of the eat less and move more explanation for the obesity crisis completely wrong. So let's discuss the study, the design, the results, and conclusions. And then I'll go ahead and give you my thoughts. So as I said, there are two sources that I'm going to make reference to here, both the 2012 study, the academic paper, as well as the piece published in Scientific American. I'm going to make reference to both. Okay. And again, both well worth the read. And not only is the information written, and not only is the information presented written for either an academic audience or a lay audience, but we get different details and insights from the study in one source versus the other. And both fascinating. Again, recommend both. Ponzer also wrote a book called Burn. New research blows the lid off of how we really burn calories. And I will confess, I haven't read the book yet. Okay, so it's possible that the book, which was written 9 years after this initial article, may represent a difference in his thinking. So I'll just put that caveat out there. All right, so as we discussed in the intros, in the study, researchers measured the caloric burn, the energy expenditure of 30 Hadza tribesmen and women. Okay, 17 women and 13 men. And they used a method called doubly labeled water, which involves each subject drinking water that has essentially been tagged with a marker, which can be measured in the urine, right? And then from there, a delta calculation can be made. So what was in the urine versus what they drank, and voila, massively oversimplifying here, but we have a measure of caloric burn, which is considered the gold standard in this case. Now, they also took other measurements, such as body weight, BMI, body fat, as well as they tracked how much the men and women in the Hadza tribe walked each day. And let me just go ahead and say, when you're looking at this chart, I knew that the Hadza were not big people, but I hadn't realized just how small these guys and girls are. Okay, keep in mind, these are all adults, but the average man, 112 pounds as an average man, 112 pounds. The average woman, 95 pounds. Okay, and they don't give us heights here, but they do give us BMI, which is 20 for both men and women. So at those weights and that BMI, it would translate to an average height of 4'10" for women and an average height of 5'3" for men. Okay, obviously not saying this in a negative way, but these are much, much smaller people, both in terms of height and weight, than the average Westerner. I was also surprised to learn that while women tend to forage for tubers and berries in groups, the men hunt alone with homemade bows. And again, just surprising because I had heard about the Hadza before. I've read some things about the Hadza, but for some reason I had in my head that these guys go out in hunting parties, right? They hunt together. But no, according to Ponzer, they typically hunt alone. Now, of course, they are master trackers. They hunt with a handmade bow, which if you get a second, just pull up a picture of a Hadza bow. Hadza is Hadza. Incredible. Okay. Just again, seems almost impossible to take down the kind of game that they go after, but they do. But of course, you'd have to be a master tracker, right, with significant ability to get in close to bring down, say, a 3,000-pound giraffe with one of these bows. But I guess they do. In fact, the piece in Scientific American starts with Ponzer, and I think it was maybe one other fellow researcher going along with a couple of Hadza guys to find a giraffe that one of them had shot with an arrow dipped in homemade poison. Which, of course, leads to all kinds of questions. You're like, A, there's something just incredible about that. But then B, like, what the hell are they using for poison? I mean, it has to be something small enough to lace the tip of an arrow, but powerful enough to take down a giraffe. And yet still not sufficiently powerful as to render the animal useless for meat. I mean, I don't know. That just strikes me as incredible. It's probably fair to say the hunting of the Hadza could be an entire podcast in and of itself, but clearly there's a lot of traditional wisdom here. But back to the study itself. After spending some time with the Hadza, having them drink the special water, collecting urine samples, Ponzer and his team are able to bring those urine samples back stateside and have it analyzed to assess caloric burn. And what they found was shocking. Caloric burn of Hadza men and women was essentially identical to their Western sedentary counterparts. Now, of course, this is a complete shock. And Ponzer says, quote, "We looked at the data every way imaginable, accounting for effects of body size, fat percentage, age, and sex. No difference. How is that possible?" End quote. Yeah, that's an odd one. And it reminds me of a quote which has been attributed to the science fiction writer Isaac Asimov. the writer of books like I, Robot, which is something to the effect of, the most exciting phrase to hear in science, the one that heralds new discoveries, is not eureka, but rather, that's funny. And I'm sure for Ponzer and his team, getting the results back on the caloric burn of the Hadza would have been a that's funny kind of a moment. Because the results seem to violate everything that we know about energy balance and metabolism. Clearly, the Hadza are more active than the typical sedentary Westerner. I mean, let's hear it from Ponzer directly, how he describes Hadza life. And, you tell me. Quote, life for the Hadza is physically demanding. Wild tubers are a staple of the Hadza diet. Men cover miles each day, hunting with bows and arrows they make themselves. When game is scarce, they use simple hatchets to chop into tree limbs, often 40 feet up in the canopy, to harvest wild honey. Even the children contribute, hauling buckets of water back from the nearest watering hole, sometimes a mile or more from camp. End quote. And yet somehow, even when making adjustments for differences in relative size and other factors, the Hadza consume and burn the same number of calories as their Western counterparts, or say traditional farming populations, which were also part of the study. Another group that you would assume with higher caloric burn due to increased physical activity. And of course, there are the gorillas, my favorite. What about gorillas? What did they find? And in fact, the paper cites research performed by other scientists who compared the energy expenditure of active wild primates versus those sedentary primates found in zoos. And they found, incredibly, that each group burned about and consumed about the same number of calories. Which leads Ponzer and his team to describe the significance of the study by saying, quote, our data indicate, contrary to received wisdom, humans tend to burn the same number of calories regardless of how physically active they are. End quote. And that the results of the study help explain why exercise generally fails to aid in weight loss. End quote. Yeah, that's funny. These results would seem to indicate that there is something fundamentally broken about our energy balance idea of weight gain. If calories consumed and calories burned are the same, then why are Westerners getting fat, yet the Hadza are staying lean? Something is off. And Ponzer and his team have some possible ideas about what might explain this, but these are just preliminary ideas. Clearly, the body has some sort of balancing mechanism, some way to adapt to the higher physical demands of the Hadza lifestyle without necessarily burning more calories. But the thing is, they calculated the Hadza burn just as many calories per mile walked as their Western counterparts. So what is it? It's got to be something other than physical work. Given how consistent caloric burn is across populations, and the researchers acknowledge that they don't really know, but they do offer up some potential explanations. First, maybe active people adjust their behavior in subtle ways. The researchers offer up like sitting rather than standing or sleeping more soundly. But they're quick to add, quote, but our analysis of the data suggests that although these behavior changes might contribute, they are not sufficient to account for the constancy seen in daily energy expenditure, end quote. Another possibility is, quote, that the body makes room for the cost of additional activity by reducing the calories spent on many unseen tasks that take up most of our daily energy budget. The housekeeping work that our cells and organs do to keep us alive. End quote. Things which might be metabolically costly, like, say, ovulation or mounting an inflammatory response. Now, are either of these two possible explanations correct? It's hard to say. More investigation would clearly be required. But what Ponzer is willing to say is that, quote, all of the evidence points toward obesity being a disease of gluttony rather than sloth. People gain weight when the calories they eat exceed the calories they expend. If daily energy expenditure has not changed over the course of human history, the primary culprit in the modern obesity epidemic must be the calories consumed. End quote. So that's the study in a nutshell. Pretty strong conclusions. And again, you get why people are confident in saying exercise doesn't help you lose weight. And I will give you some of my thoughts on the study, both on the results and on the broader considerations with respect to what exactly this means, or at least what I think it means. But before I do, I just got to pause and say I really do love this study. Okay, I think you can see why. I'm very glad that Ponser and his team thought to do this study, right, and then actually did it, because the results are so unexpected and so shocking. You can see somebody easily overlooking the need or the benefit of performing a study like this. Whatever else that you ultimately conclude, it's just a great reminder that sometimes even our most fundamental ideas and assumptions aren't quite right. But I do have some thoughts, so let's get into them. So first, as incredible as these results are, I'm not sure that the results from the study alone are enough to conclude that exercise does not assist with weight loss, because this is not exercise. Now, I don't mean that the Hadza are not physically active. Clearly they are. And I'm also not suggesting as sort of like a, bougie gym bro that, it's not exercise because there are no weights involved. What I'm saying is that as incredible as this is not exercise for the Hadza. This is life. Now, this might seem like a minor point, but this is significant here, and let me explain. In my view, and again, I don't think this is controversial when you think about it, exercise represents an increase relative to some baseline activity rate, even if that baseline is very low or very high. In order for it to count as exercise, for us to categorize it as exercise, it has to be an increase versus a baseline. The 7 miles a day walked by the average Hadza man, this is his baseline rate. Likely been doing that for years. And Ponser essentially says as much by pointing out that the children are often sent to get water, and doing so might involve walking a mile or more, bringing back buckets to do so. The men will go out hunting and walking for hours in the Tanzanian sun, and they don't even bring water, okay? I don't think it's a stretch to say this is not exercise for them. And we can see this very clearly if we just take the example of, say, muscle growth. Right? I think there's a very good parallel here. In order for you to grow muscle, right, experience hypertrophy, you have to increase workload relative to a baseline. Right? That's the whole idea of progressive overload. If we were to take two people, one guy who would say spent his entire life lifting weights, and another guy who's never lifted, it's just getting started, the amount of work that's going to be required to build additional muscle, right, incremental muscle in each case, the amount of exercise, the workload, is going to look dramatically different. In the case of the first guy, the guy who's been lifting his whole life, the amount of work that's required for him to put on additional muscle mass is going to be significant. With the second guy, the guy who's never lifted a weight in his life, he's going to be able to put on muscle mass with very little work relative to what the first guy would have to do. The first guy, if you gave him the same workout as, say, like the second guy, it's likely that he's actually going to lose muscle because that workout not only doesn't represent a stimulus, it's so sufficiently low that the guy will actually start to lose muscle mass over time. Now, if you just started with like a generic question, does lifting weights increase muscle mass? The answer is, well, clearly it depends. If it's an increase relative to the baseline, yes, sure, we can all see that. But if not, well, then no, it's not going to build muscle. In fact, you might actually lose muscle. Both gaining muscle and losing weight operate on the basis of a stimulus. It's why that even if you buy the excess calorie explanation of weight gain or weight loss, it's not about the average calories consumed, but of the change relative to the baseline. What might be a calorie deficit for a 300-pound NFL offensive lineman might be a massive surplus for a 60-year-old woman in menopause. Comparing calories between two peoples may be kind of interesting, but it's not going to explain much from the perspective of relative weight gain or weight loss. And I think the same can be said for activity. If it doesn't represent a change relative to the baseline, is it really exercise? I'm not sure that it is. And the researchers in a way acknowledge this, saying, quote, "It's important to note that this was not an intervention study. We examined habitual TEE, energy expenditure, and body composition in hunter-gatherers and Westerners, but did not examine the effects of imposing increased physical activity on Westerners. Physical activity has important positive effects on health, and increased physical activity has been shown to play an important role in weight loss and weight management programs. End quote. Well, that got buried a little bit, didn't it? No, I do agree with the researchers that they are correct in pointing to diet as the main contributing factor to, say, the rise in obesity, especially as compared with, say, a lack of exercise or our increasing sedentary nature. Okay, but there's no doubt in my mind that you take that same group of Westerners, you drop them into a Hadza camp for 6 weeks, and even let them keep eating whatever they were eating before when they were back in their sedentary lives, they're absolutely going to lose weight. No doubt in my mind about that. Walking 7 miles a day with that increased activity, yeah, they're going to lose weight. Now, is it going to be a ton of weight? Hard to predict per se, but they are absolutely going to lose weight because it's about the change relative to the baseline. And so to me, as incredible as these results are, and they are shocking, I'm not really sure that they say anything about exercise. I think they say a phenomenal amount about the power of adaptation, but not about exercise, in my humble opinion. So when I hear people say that exercise doesn't help you lose weight, including a lot of people that I like and respect, I mean, this is one of the most powerful studies to make the case. I'm just not so sure that the case is as strong as people think it is. Now, the second point that I want to talk about is, well, if walking isn't exercise, then what is it exactly? And I just sort of flippantly said, it's a means of getting around for these guys, right? It's their way of life. And in a way it is, right? I mean, we're all designed to walk. You think about an animal grazing out in a field. Nobody looks at him and thinks, man, that animal is out there working out. No, it's just part of their life. But I actually think that this walking element may explain, at least in part of the mystery. Because is it possible that walking specifically might play an actual role in weight loss and fat loss? And here, if you've listened to my episodes on Ozempic and let's just say natural weight loss or an alternative to Ozempic and GLP-1s, you already know where I'm going. Okay, but walking has been used as a powerful tool of weight loss across a number of different settings. Okay, now I don't know that it has to do with calorie burn per se. Again, one of the many reasons that I think that our current model of calories in, calories out is incomplete. Okay, walking doesn't burn a ton of calories, but it would appear to do an incredible job at helping control spikes in blood sugar, something which may be at the core of insulin resistance, metabolic dysfunction, and obesity. I'll point out that when pregnant women in the United States wind up with gestational diabetes, which unfortunately is all too common, the recommendation from doctors, okay, I'm talking Western doctors here, allopathic medicine, right? You go into your standard OB, is to walk after each meal, to go for a walk after eating, because it has been shown, demonstrated, that it can help control spikes in blood sugar. Now, isn't that very interesting? How many people know that? Let's talk bodybuilding for a second. Bodybuilders have long used walking as a way to cut weight, to burn fat, while hopefully preserving as much muscle tissue as possible. Specifically walking. Why is that? And I never pointed this out earlier, but I should have. The Hadza are not only small and light, they are very lean. Okay, low body fat percentages by modern standards. The men in the study had an average body fat of 13.5%. Okay, that is lean. And they walk a whole bunch. 7 miles translates to something like 15,000 to 17,000 steps per day. Is that a coincidence? I think you know my hunch on this. I'll give you one more. One more little data point, just something to file away and to consider on the incredible power of walking for fat loss and weight loss. Let's look at Japan. Japan is the only nation, the only country to become wealthy without becoming fat. it stands out as the single outlier that has become developed but not obese. As we covered this on my episode on Ozempic, and shout out to the excellent work of Johan Hari on this and his great book, Magic Pill, which is on Ozempic and GLP-1 agonists. Okay, I've said this before, but it's truly an excellent book. I mean, I highly, highly recommend it. Not only do I think this book accurately describes and outlines many of the concerns that reasonable people would have with respect to GLP-1 agonists, but it also, in my humble opinion, accurately puts the finger on the pulse of what has caused the obesity epidemic, which I believe, no surprise for anybody who's listened to the show, is ultra-processed foods. And Johan Hari believes this as well. But here's the thing. Hari also makes this excellent point about Japan, in that Japan is the only country to become wealthy without becoming fat. And I believe it was something like 2008. Health officials in Japan started noticing that people were starting to get a little bigger, right? They were seeing some early signs that maybe this trend was starting to reverse, and that maybe some Japanese people were starting to become overweight, maybe even obese. Now, what did they do? They enacted something called the Metabo Law, and there are many components to it. But one of the key components, I guess you could say, was sort of encouraging, maybe coercing, might be too strong of a point, but strong-arming employers with the threat of fines and sanctions if the waistlines of their employees started to grow. They started to become overweight. Now, faced with that, what empirical action did employers take in order to ensure that they remained in compliance, that their workforce remained fit and trim? Well, they started to, one, change the food that they were serving, right? Encouraging the consumption of more whole foods, not ultra-processed foods, more whole foods, minimally processed foods. But the other massive, massive component here was walking. Now, in this case, they sort of gamified it. So within an organization, you were sort of part of one of these chat groups. You would post your results, how many steps you had. There was sort of a leaderboard in many cases. So there was a gamification component to it. But the point is that this move towards whole foods and walking, it impacted all levels of the population. Okay, now in the schools, each school hired a professional chef. And this professional chef, they were tasked not only with cooking the food, but also planning the menu and sourcing local fresh ingredients to be made within the school, designing the menu to provide a balance of nutrients and cook from scratch. And they brought kids into the process too. Right? Now compare this to what the modern American public school system looks like in many cases, in which the food that's provided for the kids is provided for by, in many cases, like a large fast food chain. I mean, the difference is just remarkable. And the results have been incredible. As I said, Japan is the only nation to buck this trend, to become wealthy without getting fat. And what is it that's the secret to their success? It's whole foods and walking. Now, the last point that I'll make here, the last thing I want to comment on, is that when we look at the Hadza results from the perspective of calories in versus calories out, right? Calories consumed versus calories burned. I mean, it sort of sounds like a squared circle here. I mean, how could this possibly make any sense? How do the Hadza eat and consume the same number of calories as Westerners, but not gain any weight? I mean, I'm honestly surprised that we didn't see any suggestions of a potential genetic component as the explanation here, okay? I know for a fact if this paper came out and was widely discussed, say, in many internet circles, that would definitely be the main point that people would gravitate to. And I will point out that pound for pound, the Hadza eat a lot. Okay, 2,600 calories for a 112-pound man, it's a lot of food. I mean, rough math correlation for body weight, that would put a 180-pound man at something like 4,000 calories per day. And they'd be walking around at 13.5% body fat without going to the gym. Clearly, the Hadza know something. But maybe, just maybe, it's not about how many calories they're consuming that explains the difference, but maybe where those calories are coming from, notably where they are not coming from, is important. And that is ultra-processed foods. Now, I'm biased here, of course, But the researchers do note, I find this interesting, that they take note of the fact that the Hadza diet consists of 95% wild and foraged foods. We're talking meat, fruit, honey, tubers. Okay, not sure what the other 5% consists of. But if you move past macros for just a second, right? Well, we're all trained to think calories, macros, micros, but just move past that for a second and just ask the obvious question. What's the key difference in the food that's eaten by the Hadza and other traditional hunter-gatherers versus the food that is eaten by Westerners? It's the fact that it's not ultra-processed, that it's real, minimally or even unprocessed whole foods. And this dovetails with the work of Dr. Weston A. Price, who I've spoken about a lot in the past, so I'll just spare the introduction. But the point is that during Price's day in the 1930s, studying traditional people all over the globe, he found that despite the fact that they ate very different types of food, very different compositions, and very different macros by our standards, that's probably how we describe it today, many of them ate very simple and maybe even incomplete diets. They all enjoyed incredibly amazing health, great teeth, little to no cavities, all nose breathers, and something Price doesn't even discuss, but excellent skin, right? This is before Photoshop. This is the 1930s. And you just can't help but notice like how radiant the skin looks, even in black and white photos. And they all had one thing in common, right? They ate a wide variety of foods, but they all ate real, unprocessed, or minimally processed whole foods. The Hadza are no different. There is something about ultra-processed foods that leads to weight gain, obesity, metabolic dysfunction. Do I know exactly what that is? Does anyone know exactly what that is? I'm not sure that we do. And let's be honest, there could be multiple mechanisms at play here. But I believe that this is what complicates and maybe even obfuscates this idea of energy balance. It's what causes the paradox. This is just my view. All things equal, yes, calories in, calories out probably holds. If you eat more of the same foods but in greater quantities, we can call it greater calories, you will likely gain weight. If you eat less of the same foods, fewer calories, you will likely lose weight in the short term. But just like with physical activity, your body will begin to adapt. And many people have experienced this when they go into a deficit without changing what they eat. Or let's say they start GLP-1 agonists and eat just less of the same terrible food. Sometimes the weight seems to creep back up. All things being equal, maybe calories in, calories out is the correct way to look at things. But ultra-processed foods are a big might not be equal, at least from what I can see. Okay, that's just my 2 cents. And as I said, there are many possible mechanisms for this. But let's go all the way back to our conversation on seed oils, the work of Dr. Catherine Shanahan, and the proposed mechanism of harm. Right, this idea that the mere act of our cells, of our mitochondria, in attempting to use these toxic seed oils for fuel, damages the mitochondria. Okay, not only making it more difficult to extract the energy from these foods, but also making it more difficult for them to do the job in the future because of the damage that they sustain. Making it difficult, if not impossible, to burn the energy that is readily available and stored as fat in our bodies, which is, I think, the definition of metabolic dysfunction. Given that it's estimated that there are some 10,000 GRAS, generally recognized as safe, food additives that exist in the United States alone, many of which don't need to be added to the label, is it possible that a handful of them, maybe many of them, might damage our mitochondria in the way that, say, it's proposed with seed oils? I don't know. You tell me, but I think it's plausible. Okay, so that's going to have to be it for me today. Said a whole bunch as always. Again, a study that I really, really enjoyed. Very grateful that people like Herman Poncer are out there doing this work. Really, really enjoyed the study. And like I said, I haven't read his book yet, but I think I will. I got a long list of books to get through, but this one is definitely on the list. If you are enjoying the show, if you're enjoying this episode, please consider sharing the episode with a friend, subscribe to the podcast. That way you'll never miss an episode on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube, or wherever you prefer to listen to podcasts. Thanks again, and we'll talk next week.